Well, thank you so much for inviting Bill and I to come today and take a little bit of your time to talk about successful management planning. Everybody's been involved in project planning, whether you realize it or not. It's as easy as, how am I going to wash the car today, to am I going to put in a garden, am I going to build a dog house, or am I going to take on a multi-million-dollar radio expansion project for the agency that I work? And regardless of the scope of the project, we kind of were able to wean it down. There are like 5 elemental areas that are consistent in project planning. And there may be sub-steps to that, and how many of those steps you engage with may vary, but the essential 5 steps are going to be consistent throughout those plans. And I think, the first say is that every project needs to have a roadmap of goals to be successful right off. And let me see if I can figure out how to use this. There we go. And to make a project really successful, you have to identify ahead of time who your stakeholders are. And if you're washing your car, you may be the only person that's a stakeholder in this. And the steps that you're going through may be so the same that it's just kind of rote. You already have the bucket together with all of your supplies in it. If it's a large radio project, or maybe it's a communication system expansion in your dispatch center, your stakeholders are going to probably be numerous and varied, particularly in their experience with the planning process. So if you're a project manager in this situation, you're also going to end up needing to be a bit of an educator to your stakeholders in some cases, and helping to guide them in just what the process is for planning. And you may end up having to do a lot of hand-holding through that too, and really advocate their participation in the success of your project. So the first step that you engage in is the needs assessment. And the needs assessment is really going to become the foundation of your project through the very end when you do acceptance testing and you determine whether or not this has been successful. Because it's all going to be based on what did they want, and is the final product delivering to their expectations?
Well, one of the things that I found is that there's a lot of pushback. Oh, we know what we need. Okay, what do you need? Oh, we know what we need. No, can you write it down? Oh, but we know what we need. No, you need to have the discipline to identify the needs. It's also important to identify needs versus wants. Because we all want a lot of things, but we may not need it. I mean, that's, the Rolling Stones wrote a song about that. You can't always get what you want. But if you try, you'll get what you need. The next discipline thing that I ask people to do is tell me what you want in plain language, okay? I don't want to be told, oh, I want an MPLS microwave. No, that's not your, we'll figure that out. You need a microwave that'll transport this amount of information from here to here. So keep it to simple, non-technical terms so that you totally understand what those needs are. I'll do the technology for you. And also more important, you don't say, oh, want Motorola. Which may be a good answer, but I'm sure you've all seen that little cartoon of the police chief want Motorola. I don't want to hear want Motorola. I don't want to hear I want Harris or Alcatel or whatever else it was. You want a system that does these things, okay? You need a system that has these features, and it should all be in very plain language. It's also important that you prioritize that. Number one, it has to be this. Number two, it has to be that. It would be nice if we had this and a few other features, because no matter how well-funded the organization or the project is, at the end, you're going to have to balance the needs versus the wants versus the reality of your budget. In my entire life, I've only had one project that had no budget. Time was more important than money in that one project. Every other project, both on the private side in the radio broadcast world, as well as public safety thing, there's been a budget. In many cases, while we're developing the project and the costs are going up, the people in charge of the money are saying, oh, by the way, Bill, we had to take 20% off of your budget. So I've had a number of projects that the costs are going this way and the budget's going that way. So it's very important that we get those needs done so that as we're developing it, we can balance all of those compromises.
And the needs assessment can either be done in-house, or several times organizations, if it's a really expensive project, they may hire a consultant or a third party to come in and conduct that needs assessment as a means of efficiency, and also to ensure that they're collecting all of the information that's needed. As Bill mentioned, sometimes you have predetermined budgetary limits. For example, we're replacing all of the dispatch console workstations. We only have $20,000 to do it. Set forth and pick your equipment. Or we know we need to replace our computer-aided dispatch system. We have talked to other agencies in the last year that have acquired center systems, and centers our size have done so for around a $2 million budget. So sometimes they know a ballpark ahead of time, but in most cases, in large-scale projects, that budget estimate will be developed through the planning process. And then prior to actually implementing and moving forth and ordering any equipment, as the project manager, you will have established an estimated budget, and that will go forth for approval. It may be through your county board of supervisors or a county administrator. Perhaps if you're work with a board of directors, they'll be the persons that have to approve it. Ultimately, these are your sponsors on the project and the people that you will need to keep happy with and be accountable to at the end of the project. And so they're going to give you a go-ahead with a budgetary estimate to move forth on the project. So at this point, we have our needs assessment. You've been appointed as the project manager. And there are a couple things, if you've never managed a project before, that you kind of want to take a look at, and those might be to ensure that your needs assessment has been completed, that you know what the objectives are, that you've identified what your deliverables will need to be, because all of that, again, is going to be accountable in the success of your project at the very end. If you don't have that information and it's not clear to you, you need to make sure you collect it. The next important thing is to put together a project team that that has a vested interest in the outcome of this project. They should be people that can bring practical experience, functional expertise to the project. This project team is going to be your advocates to your users and to anybody else affected on buy-in onto the project and helping you educate the many users of the end result of the project. So you want people that are going to be interested in participating on the project. And even as important as getting your team is to get the commitment from your project sponsors for their participation. There's nothing more frustrating when you're running a project than to have a constant rotation of representatives from the number of agencies you're working with showing up at the table, or maybe members only come once every 3 or 4 meetings, and so you're spending the first half of your meetings bringing them up to speed on what's transpired or where you're at in the project. So being really upfront about what the expected obligations of time and duties and responsibilities with your member agencies or whoever is providing your team member resources is very, very important. So if you know you're going to be meeting like once a week, once a month, or that you expect that their assignment is going to require X number of hours every week to participate, you want to be upfront and make sure that either it's that department head knows that they say, yes, we'll make sure that they have the time. Because consistency is so important in the overall outcome. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to that? So we create a list of our deliverables, and then we need to develop the project plan. And the plan is really based a lot around what are the deliverables and when you expect them to be completed. These deliverables come from that needs assessment. So you need to break down the tasks that are going to be involved. And for example, let's say we're picking new radios for the back room, new receivers, transceivers, what have you. So maybe we've identified this is what we need. We think we need X numbers of them. We need to issue an RFP. We need to evaluate responses, or where you can set kind of a calendar timeline to start getting an estimated idea of how long this project is going to take to complete. From that, you're going to identify who on your team is going to be involved in each of those deliverables. You're going to use that to develop what your milestones are. And milestones are really great points in the process to retouch base with your stakeholders, just to reevaluate the plan to ensure that we're all still on the same track and that the goals and the objectives are still consistent. And then establishing your project reporting guidelines. How often are you going to communicate with your team, with your sponsors, and with your stakeholders? Is this going to be a weekly session? Are you going to meet monthly? Are you going to do it all online? Are you going to send not just emails, but have conference calls? You know, what is the process? And a lot of these can be done in conversation with the team to ensure that everybody's on board with how those communications are going to occur. Because there's nothing worse or more embarrassing than for you as a project manager to be having these encounters with your team members and you're making decisions, you move forward, and one of your sponsors is not in the loop, and they're having a conversation with somebody else, and they find out information that they didn't know about the project. And they're going, huh, when did that happen? Or who made that decision? And then you get a phone call. And so communication is probably the biggest asset you have as a project manager in achieving success. Bill and I talked a lot about project risks, and this is really something that you should be doing with your project team. And a risk is any event that's going to impact your project, be it positively or negatively. And if you can collectively sit down and identify ahead of time what those risks are and identify potential strategies to resolve or address those risks should they occur, you're going to save yourself a lot of stress, a lot of heartache, and a lot of time down the road. And particularly if you can, at the front of your project, let your sponsors know, and this could just be through an email, these are what identified risks are, and these are what our strategies are going to be to address them. I think one of the big things that Bill talked, and maybe we can talk about now, is project creep.
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that you're going to find as we go through this presentation is that most of the work of the project is in the first step. Because once you've got your plan, we're in plan development, but once you get the needs assessment and the plan development down, everything else basically flows. You've got it all figured out. And it's really, really important, again, to have your needs identified, prioritized, and ready to go so that you're not 2/3 down the road and somebody says, oh, but we want to add a, well, you can always do that, but all that does is put a huge bump into your planning process and an even bigger bump into your budget. So project creep is part of this whole communications thing and part of project management saying, that's a great idea, but we're not going to do it on this project. So needs assessment is critical to get started, and in your plan development, you got to make sure that you honor that foundation, the needs assessment.
Are there any questions so far? You know, we're racing through really quickly today because we know you're all very hungry. The next process, after you've identified your risks, you've identified alternatives that you may put in place to deal with those risks, is to include in this, and I forgot to put it up here, but lessons learned, which is a really, really beneficial, I can't say enough, strategy to have under your belt in doing a process. If you've never gone through this type of a project before, APCO is a tremendous resource in connecting you to other professionals and colleagues that may have gone through this process that you can call and say, hey, what did you learn when you went through your acquisition for this or when you built your new facility? You know, what came up that you didn't anticipate? How did you address with that? You know, if you could do it over, what would you do differently? So you want to review lessons learned, and if you haven't been keeping track of those things in-house on previous projects, be the first, and then track those lessons throughout the course of your project. And at the end, do a little summary, if not just for yourself, but someplace so that whoever comes in behind you as a project manager can look at that. Because it's, again, it's another great way to save yourself time and a lot of, headaches down the road. Okay, so by now you pretty much have a plan in place. So now we get into the conceptual design. How do we start moving towards implementation? We know what our needs are. We have a project team in place. We have done our risk management analysis. So now what's the next step?
Well, and this is where I start to have fun, because the needs assessment is a lot of work and the plan development is a lot of work. But once we're getting together, we have all this information, and now I try to take that information and turn it into something that is what you want. So I take the conceptual, the deliverables and the needs assessment, and I come up with a sketch of how it goes together. I share that sketch with you, you're the client or the team, and say, okay, this is what you want. And a lot of times they'll say, well, gee, Bill, we forgot to, or you didn't get this right, or whatever, and we move things around on the conceptual line. That's no big deal. These are marks on paper. It costs basically nothing to do a conceptual design, because I haven't gotten into any heavy-duty details. We haven't gotten vendors involved. All I spend is an hour or two at Visio. So we work together on the plan, go through a couple, 3 iterations. Now you say, this is exactly what we want. I can then take that plan and go to Motorola or Harris or Alcatel and say, this is what these guys want. Can you give me an idea what it's going to cost? Because we can build a budgetary estimate based upon that conceptual design. And this, oops, you went ahead of me. This is kind of what it looks like. And it shows various sites that are interconnected with microwave and UHF links, and there's various kinds of radios at the different sites. This is actually real. I just sanitized it a lot. But a couple things that are important to notice here. There's no make, model, part numbers, nothing. They're functional blocks. Duplexer, transceiver, channel bank, microwave. So anybody can come back to me and say, hey, I can build this, because I haven't worried about whether or not Motorola makes that kind of base station, or whether I should have a telewave or an antenna specialist duplexer, or what kind of antenna. We haven't done that. This is a conceptual design, but I can look at it and say, yes, okay, this site has the right number of radios, and this site here only has one kind of radio, and we can play around with that. This, by the way, is like the 4th or 5th generation conceptual design for that project, but this is a concept still, but it is something that we can use as a tool to communicate between the team and maybe your engineering consultant and vendors, to make sure that we're all on the same page, and this is really what we want. Because that's very important here, is that as we start to develop the next steps, the details start to become important. We can't be moving pieces around. So the conceptual design, however we present it, is key to making sure you understand this is what you need, and this is how you're going to get there, how your engineering people can sort that out, and how vendors can actually deliver what you want.
Go ahead, get the next one, design freeze.
Okay. And now we get into the procurement side. We've done all the work. We know exactly what you need. We have a good idea of what the conceptual design is. We put together technical specifications. That's something that CSI is very good at, on making sure the specifications are industry-wide, well-acknowledged, and not some secret kind of sauce. It's all, we're very big on EIA, TSB, and all of the industry standards kind of things, so that everybody can come back with a level playing ground, because the best kind of specification and design and everything else, when you go out to bid, I remember, Jay used to beat me up saying, Bill, that's a Harris spec. And at the same time, the Harris guy, John, would say, Bill, that's an Alcatel spec. That meant that we're so fair that both of them think that I was fudging it back and forth. But we really want to have a good spec, because in most government procurements, it has to be bid. You want to make sure that your bid is the same, and so you can compare the two, because a sloppy bid will get you not necessarily what you want. So we go through the process, we do the specs, we issue the request, we review the spec. Site demos sometimes, like in Marianne's world, they need to see hands-on what a CAD system looks like. They need to see how the screens look. They need to see a lot of things. It isn't just wires. There's a lot of human interaction there. So you set up the demos, and we collect all this information, reference checks, making sure they can actually deliver it. And at the end of that process, we'll make a recommendation to the sponsor saying, we've decided based upon this information, blah, 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 therefore we recommend that you select these people as your vendor. So that would be the procurement part of the thing, and And at that point, it goes over to your purchasing department and the order gets submitted.
Bill kind of touched on design freeze a little bit already, and this is, again, one of those bullet points in managing project creep. If you've got everybody on board from the front end and the get-go of, this is what we're doing, this is what the design is going to look like, you can avoid and minimize or mitigate change orders down the road, which often can be costly. You can avoid miscommunications of what the expectations were, both from your stakeholders and from vendors. You can make the project go so much smoother. So trying to get as much clarification and finality at the front end of what the design and what the basis of the project is going to go a long way for you. Once items have been ordered, confirming your product deliverables with the vendor. Sometimes you say, oh yeah, we can get that there in 4 weeks, and then you find out, no, the equipment's actually manufactured overseas and it's going to take 6 months because they have to put it on a container on the slow boat, and that's how long it's going to take to get here. So confirming right up front what your deliverables are with your vendors, going in and updating or modifying your project timeline accordingly is very important at this point. And then doing your official kickoff of the project. And your kickoff meeting should contain, or should be attended, not just by your team members, but your sponsors, your vendors, and any stakeholders that might have an interest should be invited to attend. And this is your opportunity, again, as the project manager, to review roles, responsibilities, activities, timelines, and then also to talk about your risks and keeping your project on track. And just, again, making sure that everybody is going forth with the same piece of paper, with the same timeline, and with the same expectations.
This is an example in the kickoff meeting with a project that Kent is very familiar with. We're building a radio site for him at Rio Consumnes. And one of the things we said to the vendors is, it is the inside of a jail. They will run your driver's license. If you send anybody to the site, make sure that they are clean. And halfway through the project, they were complaining because too many guys were being arrested. Well, duh, we told you it's a jail. You can check in, but you don't necessarily check out. And, you know, but site access is a real problem. Many agencies now require they run a background check on everybody who has access to facilities. That takes time. If you've got people that have questionable backgrounds, don't put them through that. You know, do you work on Saturdays and Sundays? Yes or no. Some people do, some people don't. Do you work from dawn to dusk? Some people do. Some people say, no, 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 we can only operate from 9 to 4, period, that's it. So all of these little details have to be communicated to the vendor before you start. And that's what the kickoff meeting is about, is where you sort all those things out. But I want to come back and ask a question here. Dan and Jay, what happens when you're in the middle of a large project, the contract's been signed, and they say, oh, but we want to add what happens to the timeline? What happens to the budget?
You want me to say the change order word? Is that right?
Yeah.
The timeline will increase, and the cost could possibly.
Yeah, so a design freeze, when I worked for Sony, they had a ritual, the final design review. They put a stamp on each page that said, this is what I want. Any change after this is a change order, and they made the clients sign each page of the drawings. And that way, if there's any question down the road, there was no question about that. The client signed off on every page of the drawing. I've never done that in the public safety world, but it's really important that you have your needs assessment done, your project plan done, and everything all locked down, because once you get into the implementation, a little bit of, oh, wouldn't it be nice, can be really, really, really expensive.
And it's all the government processes can be very cumbersome anyway, and for many of us, a change order could require going back to the board, going back to the project sponsors, and submitting the change order, the justifications, how you expect to incorporate that into the budget, and if you take that on, where you're going to make other changes. So it can just, like you said, it can add a lot of time. I think it's important, though, as a project manager, that you not be afraid of the change. I mean, you can't embrace it, you know, if the change comes in and it's something that's going to add benefit to your project and you can justify it easily, don't fight it. You know, take it forward. So I think a lot of this is attitude. And I think it's really important as the project manager that you really work on your relationships with your vendors on the project. And if you're not the person that can also act as the public relations person on this project, that you appoint another member of your team as the PR conduit with the vendors. I've seen a number of projects get drawn out extensively because of animosity that starts occurring during the process and finger pointing that starts occurring during the process. And so keeping that good communication, that open relationship, I mean, the bottom line is we all want success. You know, vendors want us to recommend their products, to be their reference when they go to another client. You want the system to work. You want your stakeholders to be happy with the outcome because they've invested a lot of money into it. So it's a win-win, and it's very important that that is always at the top of your moniker when you're a project manager, is that we have to have a win-win here. So we need to really work together, and there may need to be concessions made on both sides. But the bottom line is you're all working towards the same thing. Step 5, I told you we'd be getting through this really darn quick. Final acceptance. A lot of times, like in the case of big radio projects, say CSI has designed the system for you, they're going to take the lead in developing this punch list that's going to be utilized by the vendor and the project team side to see if the deliverables are actually working and functioning the way that they're supposed to. And they're going to be testing all the equipment and witnessing and signing it off. If there are issues in the process at this point that need resolution, you know, this is where it's going to occur, really working with that vendor to make sure that you're getting what you purchased and what you both understood was to be delivered. You want to make sure that you get copies of all reports or inspection reports that may be done. So, for example, you're building a new radio site, and you've had to have county building inspectors out there to look not only at the concrete foundation, but maybe they've had to inspect the tower to ensure that it's meeting all building code compliance areas. So all of your inspection reports should be collected. Once all obligations have been met, equipment is performing satisfactorily, you're meeting all of your code and industry specifications and requirements. It's only at that point that as a project manager you can make a recommendation to the sponsors to make those final payments, you know, to pay off the project. You know, but you want to have all of that done beforehand.
The other, and I'm beating this to death, but it's really, really important. The acceptance testing, the criteria for the acceptance testing is your needs assessment. So when we write an acceptance test, it basically takes the list of the needs that there was identified on step 1 and go through one at a time and say, okay, we had this need, do we meet the need? Yes or no. Do we have this need? Yes or no. And so we verify in the acceptance testing that the identified needs at the beginning of the project have been met. And that gives you the full circle to be sure that your project is what you wanted to have.
And once that has been completed, your final tasks as a project manager is to thank those people that really participated in this whole process with you. You may be months or years into your project, but you can't forget to thank those folks that are so important. The project team members that gave up time and energy and efforts to participate, the sponsors who were committed and supportive to you through the process, any stakeholders for their patience. You know, I'll tell you, we did a multi-million-dollar radio project in Yolo County before I retired that involved several volunteer fire districts covering rural areas. And they had a lot of issues in radio reception and clarity, and keeping them apprised and keeping their patience and their participation throughout the process was so important, and thanking them at the end for being supportive and being patient was really important. And then your vendors. I mean, the vendors are our partners in these processes, and thanking them too for their partnership is a very important aspect. And then the final one is, you know, pat yourself on the back, because probably no one else will, you know. And then the final again is write down those lessons learned through this process, and then share that with your sponsors at the end and let them know, give them a recap of the project so that they fully understand what was involved and how many hours were involved in this, and the commitment level across a lot of personnel and staff in your own organizations and surrounding organizations. You know, I think sometimes it's out of sight, out of mind, and you have sponsors that aren't as actively engaged and they don't realize the scope of what has occurred, and that it's a nice way to bring them back into partnership on that with you. So, anything else?
So, oh, well, hit the next slide. We've taken this and broken it down into a one sheet, just as a summary of what we did, and pass it back. But by simplifying down to one page doesn't mean that we made it any easier. So, we don't want to be holding up breakfast and lunch, but any questions on the process here?
Yes.
Will this be available on the national website?
Yeah, I'm going to do PDF and get it to the NAPCO website.
Your process included you as the design team as well. And would you also be a project manager company that would not do the design? You know, because a lot of times a vendor is going to want to use their engineers and their design, and we're going to hold them accountable for the outcome.
Sure.
So are you flexible to
It all
do it
depends.
either way?
And there is no such thing as a cookie cutter project. Every project we've done has been slightly different than the last project we've done, and every client has a different way of looking at things, and sometimes whatever. I think that we can definitely work with you in the needs assessment and project development, come up to the conceptual design, say broadly this is what you want it to happen, and then you can take and run with it any way you want. So we can be all or none, or whatever works out best for other people. I mean, we have a lot of experience that we've done. One of the things, this is a background, I don't know, 10 years ago, we were sitting around, a bunch of us, and we were talking, basically telling sea stories, or war stories, however you want to look at it. And we realized towards the end of that all of the successes had commonality, and all the failures had commonality. And from that, we developed the broad 5 steps. And that's sort of become our Bible now and our mantra. If you do the 5 steps and do a good job on it, you'll have a successful project. You can hire us for any part of that. And as far as I'm concerned, you can not hire us for any part of that. We would like you to be successful. We can bring in expertise at anywhere you want to. You know, Marianne is the dispatch side more than I'm the radio side, and we have other kind of people we can do that. But what we're doing here today is saying, if you want to do something, anything from a $100 million communication thing to putting a new doghouse in your backyard, you're going to go through the 5 steps. And if you do the 5 steps at the end of that project, no matter what it is, you're going to be successful. And that's the only thing that's important.
Thanks.
Well, thank you again for inviting us to be here. It was really nice, and we appreciate that very much.